And where we're going today is we're going to learn about Abraham. And I'm titling this Abraham, the very human father of the faith. And since Abraham is called the father of the faith or the father of the faithful, it will really help us if we understand more about him. And Bill Schlegel and I have been working hard over the last number of months to translate Genesis. We're in the middle of the Abraham record, but I've already learned so many things that I didn't know before that I just have been super inspired to want to share some of them with you. I will freely admit that as I was looking over my notes between Genesis 11 and Genesis 15, I was like, ooh, this is a lot for a Sunday morning. So we'll see, we'll see how far we get, but I'm really excited about sharing some of the things we're learning about Abraham. So let's start in Genesis chapter 11. One thing that isn't in the text, but is apparent as you read the text and study the chronology, is that when you get to Genesis chapter 11 and you get to verse 27, and it says, now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. That we've just completed 10 chapters and we're into the 11th chapter of Genesis, and yet chronologically, we're halfway through the Bible. The man Abraham is basically around 2000 BC, so 2000 years are in front of him, 2000 years are behind him. So from Genesis 12 all the way through Malachi up to Jesus Christ, that's about 2000 years. That's the half of the Bible that goes from Genesis 11 or 12 up through Jesus Christ. The first half of the Bible is before Genesis 11, from Adam up until the life of Terah. So that having said, now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. That becomes important because Lot, of course, is going to tag along with Abraham, be very involved with his life. Verse 28, Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldees. And this shows some of the outworking of sin. Sin has now been working in the world for some 2000 years, and Haran is the first person in the Bible who was mentioned who died before his father. And as was mentioned in the song about laying down my pain and my shame and my sorrow, there's a lot of pain and sorrow in life, and one of the most painful things anyone could go through would be the death of a child. And Terah certainly went through that pain as Nahor, as Haran died before he did. Verse 29, Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, who was also the father of Iscah. And then 30 tells us Sarah was barren. She had no child. Verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. They went from Ur the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, but they went as far as Haran and settled there. Now I'm going to share a Bible map with you. And so I'm going to share my screen, because this is one of the things that I have learned since translating this with Bill. So what I'm going to share, I've only known for a few weeks at best. Now, this is the standard, you all can see the little hand, I think, on the map, right? Okay, good deal. So this is the standard Ur of the Chaldees that I believed for years was the Ur spoken of by here in Genesis. There was a good reason why people chose this Ur. In the 20s and 30s, in the 1920s and the 1930s, a man named Sir Leonard Woolley excavated Ur, found all kinds of cool stuff and things about the civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization that people didn't know. He also claimed he found evidence for the Noah's flood. That was later disproved, but it took years and years to disprove it. So people were very excited about Ur. It got a lot of attention. So, of course, excuse me, people said, well, this must be the Ur of Abraham. And so they have Abraham traveling the 600 miles to Haran. What was not known at the time, or known well at the time, but now has been established very solidly, is that there is another Ur. And here it is, less than a hand's breadth from Haran. In fact, there's an Ur that's only about 30 miles from Haran. Interestingly enough, the people known as the Chaldees lived in this area at the time of Abraham. They did not live in this area at the time of Abraham. And even though so many tablets have been excavated from this area of Babylon that mention Ur, not one tablet ever calls this southern Ur of the Chaldees. So there's very solid evidence, and I'm not going to go into it because that would be a teaching in itself. But if you want to go to the REB commentary on Genesis 11:31, there are at least 8 good reasons why this upper Ur should be Ur of the Chaldees. Now that becomes very important for a couple reasons, because this in verse 31, and I can stop sharing, I guess. So here in Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, Lot the son of Haran his grandson, Sarah his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife. So it's Terah here who's leading this, not Abraham. And he's going to go, and they're going to go from Ur of the Chaldees to the land of Canaan. But they went as far as Haran. Great, 30 miles, and settled there. Now, why they only went 30 miles isn't spoken about. It could be because of Terah's age. It could be because Terah just didn't have the willpower to press on into Canaan, where there were a lot of tribes that he didn't know and a lot of danger. There could have been a number of reasons. It doesn't tell us why Haran only went 30 miles, but then he died there. Verse 32, the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. By the way, I should go back to the map just a second and point out something that, there are things that when you're dealing with error, let's see, did the right map come up? I think it did. When you're dealing with error, there's things that don't ever make sense. It never made sense to me why, if Abraham and his family were leaving Ur to go to Canaan, they would go all the way north to Haran when they didn't need to. They could save themselves hundreds of miles by going this way, across here through Tadmor and over to Kadesh and down. So this is one of those things that's like, I wonder why they would do that. And then you find out, okay, well, that was wrong all along. And it's interesting how if we continue to keep searching for truth, then the Bible becomes more self-revealing. Now, verse 12, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house and go to the land I will show you. This now begins to make sense. The southern Ur, if Abraham's living in Haran, his country isn't Haran. His country is Ur. But if the Haran he's staying at is only 30 miles from Haran, then this makes perfect sense. Go from your country and from your relatives, all who lived in the general area. So God speaks to Abraham and says, go to the land that I will show you, which of course we know is the promised land. Now, as we know, and as we will see, the promised land at this point, it wasn't like nobody lived there. There were a lot of tribes that lived there. And anybody who studies ancient customs knows that if you show up in a strange area, when you've got flocks and herds and a beautiful wife and that kind of thing, then it was very common that you would be killed and your stuff would be stolen. Even frankly, in what we would call historic times. I mean, in the customs books that I read from the 1800s, this was still going on. People were still robbed all the time. And some of those people were killed. So this, so this is really spooky stuff. And when we talk about Abraham being the father of the faith, there are times when God asks us to do spooky stuff, or God may not speak to us directly. It may just be something that we morally know we need to do. And we don't exactly know what the outcome is going to be. But if we will press in to the faith, that's what Abraham did. Verse 2, God promises, and I will make of you a great nation. Now, he's going to say this a number of times in a number of different ways. But here, basically, he's saying, I'm going to multiply your seed, will bless you, make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And so these are the things that God promises. Verse 3, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who treats you with contempt, I will curse. And all the clans of the earth will be blessed by you. And there's a lot in this. And again, there was new learning for me, because both of the versions that I grew up using, or grew up since I became a Christian, the King James and the NIV says, I will curse those who curse you. But in the Hebrew text, the word curse is not, it doesn't occur twice. The first word, if you look at the REV, if you're reading the REV, the one who treats you with contempt, that word often in a lot of the versions, starting way back with the King James, got translated cursed, but it's not. It is not the word cursed. And this becomes very important when we understand what a curse really is, because a curse is words spoken that have spiritual power behind them. And that's why curses, it says in Exodus, if you curse your mother and father, you're to be put to death. And why would that be? Because a genuine curse has genuine spiritual power. And this is not that. This is God saying, his plan is going to come through Abraham. And then Abraham's children, his Messiah that's going to save the world is going to come through this lineage. And so he is vested, God is incredibly vested in protecting the heritage of Abraham. And so he says, I will bless those that bless you, and the one who treats you with contempt, I will curse. Meaning if you treat Abraham, and by the way, this would then go down through the ages and eventually end up in Jesus Christ. And if you treat Jesus Christ with contempt, then you will have problems from God. Now, ultimately, if you never even get saved, then the ultimate curse is you're going to be annihilated in the lake of fire. But even 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says that if you mar the body of Christ, God will mar you. People can't get away with hurting God's people year after year after year and not suffer consequences for it. So God here says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who treats you with contempt I will curse, and all the clans of the earth will be blessed by you. Verse 4, so Abraham went just as Yahweh told him to. There's the father of the faith. That's you and me. That's what we do. We do what God says. We do what is right. If you're faced with a decision, you do your best right choice. He went as God told him to. Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 when he departed from Haran. When you run the genealogies, then we know that Sarai was 65. Verse 5, Abram took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, along with all their possessions that they had gained from the people who they had acquired in Haran. Abraham was apparently quite a businessman, and he acquired he acquired possessions and slaves in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. That could have been in parentheses. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. What's God telling you here? God's telling you, and we know this from history, the land of Israel was God's chosen land. It was the place that God chose to put his name there. And he makes a huge deal about this in the book of Deuteronomy. It talks about the place that I shall choose, the place that I choose. The phrase occurs over and over in the book of Deuteronomy. And he chose to put his name in the promised land. Well, that didn't make the adversary very happy. So, you don't see the adversary, attacking, say, Antarctica, or something like that. As soon as the adversary got wind, which he would do when God told Abram to go to the promised land and said that he would build a nation, later on he's going to say that, I will give your seed this land. Galatians 3 says your seed is Christ. So the adversary got wind of this, and he's going to start to build his people in the land, the promised land. And you'll see this. We start out here with, at that time, the Canaanite was in the land. And what do we know about the Canaanites? They were an incredibly ungodly people. And in time, actually fairly quickly after the flood, they became infected with the Nephilim, people that were spiritually, genetically manipulated by demons. And you can read about that and who the Nephilim were in the REB commentary in Genesis 6. So anyway, when it says the Canaanites were in the land, it's telling you this for two primary reasons that I can think of. One is to let you know that the adversary sees what God is doing and is beginning to move to take possession of the land that God would want to give to his people. The second thing we see is that this kind of thing put Abraham in danger, because the Canaanites were very, very evil people, just as later on we see the Philistines and others who are very evil, and how they treat God's people, how they try to conquer God's people, suppress and oppress God's people, that kind of thing. So the Canaanites are in the land. Verse 7, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. This is the first time this promise appears. God's going to make this promise over and over again, but the first time it appears is here, that the land of Israel is going to be God's land. By the way, Psalm 24 says the earth is the Lord's. Yahweh created the heavens and the earth, and he owns it. Now, he gave dominion of it to Adam, who gave dominion, transferred dominion to the devil, but God still owns the earth. And he wanted to give the land of Israel to his people. And that's why Israel today has a legitimate claim on the land. The adversary's people should never have been there. And frankly, had the Israelites done their job through history, they wouldn't have been there. But now there's a big mess over there. So anyway, here in verse 7, Abraham says, God says, I'll give this land to your seed. And verse 7, I like verse 7, because what you've got here is a promise from Yahweh to Abram. I will give this land to your seed. So the verse goes and says, so Abram said, thank you. And that was it. No, I don't think so. The response to God giving you a blessing is worship in return. And I think this is really powerful. And frankly, I think you and I get off easy, because, we can worship in spirit and truth. I can sit in my easy chair with a cup of coffee and pray in tongues and worship God. And thankfully, I don't have to do this. I mean, here's Abraham. He's 75 years old. He built an altar to the Lord. We actually debated translating the Hebrew as altar. We finally decided we had to translate it altar, because if we translated the Hebrew as what it really says, which is slaughter site, the Hebrew word that gets translated as the English word altar, check your Hebrew word, is killing site or slaughter site. And he's going to kill animals on it. So altars were not pretty. And frankly, they were very large. If you're going to burn a sheep or a cow, an ox, then it never fit on my backyard grill. I don't have a particularly large grill, but even if I had the largest grill they make, I don't think I could grill a cow on it. So this altar, it's built up of rocks and it's huge. How long do you think it took Abraham to build this altar? I mean, I can't imagine he could conclude it in a day. This is a project, that would have taken days. And it says he built an altar there to Yahweh who appeared to him. So first of all, it cost him time. It cost him effort and energy. And then it was expensive because no sooner did he have the thing built than he had to kill something and burn it on the altar. And so there's a lot of effort and energy and time involved here. And what are we looking at? We're looking at God made a promise to Abraham, and Abraham's response was from his heart, I owe you something. I don't owe you just a thanks or something that's easy. I should respond in kind. You've made this great promise to me. Think about the promise that we have of everlasting life through Jesus Christ. Then what is our effort in worship in return? Do we really focus on reading the Bible, figuring out what God wants us to do, and then doing it? That is an appropriate response. And so Abraham builds an altar here. And, he's going to come back here and worship on this altar again in his life. But interestingly enough, we're going to see that in other places, in fact, the very next verse, he goes and does it again. Because in verse 8, it says, from there, he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. So Abraham's moving south. He moves down from Haran to Shechem. Now he's moving south from Shechem to Bethel and Ai, about 10 miles north of what you and I know as Jerusalem. So it's having Bethel on the west, Ai on the east, and he built an altar to Yahweh there. It's like, okay, so what do we see again? We see the effort and energy and worship. Why? Because Abram loved God. Abraham got this promise from God and figured, if you're doing this for me, I owe you worship. And this is what it was going to take. Then there's another thing that is added in here that I think we need to pay attention to, because it says in verse 8, he built an altar to Yahweh there and called on the name of Yahweh. And called on the name of Yahweh is a formula, a prayer formula that you can trace through the Old Testament. You can put called on Yahweh in your Boolean search function in Bibles that have it. The REV has one. And you'll see that it occurs a number of times, and it means prayer. When Abraham called on the name of the Lord, he already believed in Yahweh. Yahweh had already appeared to him. I mean, this wasn't about deciding whether or not Yahweh was real. This is asking Yahweh for things. And in the context of the Canaanites were then in the land, I can guarantee you one of the things he was asking for was protection. Now, this becomes very important to us in the New Testament. You keep your ribbon or note here, whatever you do, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Because there's a debate in Christianity about, can we pray to Jesus? And the biblical answer is yes. By the way, in the REV, we have an entire appendix on prayer to Jesus. But I just want to cover this because it comes up in Genesis. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother, verse 2, to the church of God that's at Corinth, to those who've been made holy in Christ Jesus, called ones, holy ones, with all those in every place who call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Theirs and ours. Call on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. These are our Christian brothers and sisters in the first century at the lifetime of the Apostle Paul who are praying to Jesus. They are calling upon him in the same way that Abraham called upon Yahweh. Now, did those early Christians also pray to God? Absolutely. And we have evidence of that in the book of Acts. but they also prayed to Jesus. And I think, people say, well, how do you know when to pray to whom? Great question. The Bible never tells us. The Bible never tells us, well, pray this prayer to God, this prayer to Jesus. So this is something you work out in your own personal devotional life, but between you and the Father and you and the Lord. Some people are uncomfortable praying to Jesus. It doesn't say you have to pray to Jesus. So some people are very comfortable praying to Jesus. The point is doctrinally, we can pray to Jesus. Then people have said to me, well, isn't Jesus a human being? How can he answer all these prayers? I have no idea. God simply doesn't tell us that. Here's what I know. The text says we can pray to Jesus. So, and by the way, this isn't the only place. Like I say, there's an entire appendix on this. So just so we're aware, let's go back to Genesis. And we're in Genesis chapter 12. So he's called on the name of Yahweh. And then verse 9, Abram traveled, going on by stages to the Negev. And if you want to take a look at that in the commentary, it's really a cool picture in the Hebrew text, because the phrase translated by stages is our nuance of understanding of the Hebrew text, which really in its first definition means more like pulling up. So it would be a very graphic picture of Abraham's travel. Would be Abraham traveled going on, pulling up toward the Negev, meaning he pulled up his tent stakes. So Abraham was a shepherd and a guy who lived in a tent, and so he would set up his tent, and then as he moved south, from Haran into the Promised Land to Shechem, south into the Promised Land to between Bethel and Ai, south into the Promised Land toward the Negev. Every time he moves, he's pulling up his stakes, pulling up his stakes, pulling up his stakes. If you've ever traveled that way or camped and tented campsite after campsite, I've hiked that way in the Appalachian Mountains, the Appalachian Trail. I've hiked that way in New York State as well, where my father lived. And you every day at the end of the day, when you get where you're going, you set up your tent, and every morning you take down your tent and walk a little farther on. And that's precisely what Abraham is doing here. Verse 10, then there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, meaning to live there temporarily, because the famine was severe in the land. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, look, I know that you're a beautiful woman. So when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will keep you alive. Now, this is a very real possibility. But what happened to Abraham, the father of the faith? Abraham, like, where's your trust in God? And one of the things that we see here is that here's Abraham, who's the only man in the Bible called a friend of God, who's called the father of the faith. And yet here he doesn't have enough trust in God to protect him. And he's willing to hand over his wife. I mean, this is what we're not talking about, somebody borrowing her for a little bit, so she could teach her something. This is Abraham. He's going to literally just hand over his wife to save his life. And it's like, what about just trying to eke out a living up in Canaan? Wouldn't that have been a better move? And one of the lessons here that we can learn from this is that you can trust God, you can love God, you can pray and read your Bible, and in tough situations, you can still have a breakdown or a meltdown or be perfectly human or just be perfectly human in life, and it doesn't mean that you don't love God. Abraham loved God, and he trusted God, but he didn't trust God in this. And that should be a huge lesson for us, because there are areas in our lives for each one of us where we're weak, where we don't trust God as strongly as we should. Maybe other people in some area have great trust for God, but we don't have trust for God in that area. But then we've got trust for God in another area that people don't have trust God for. You don't have to be a 100% person, that everything is perfect, everything is great in order to love God and try to do his will. Because Abraham definitely loved God and definitely tried to do his will, but this to me is pretty pretty serious when you're going to give away your wife. And furthermore, God in chapter 15, if we get there, is going to say, Abraham, I am your shield. I am your shield. And yet you go forward, let's just go there. Let's go forward a couple chapters to Genesis chapter 20. In Genesis chapter 20, what's Abram doing? He's wandering around the southwestern Negev, and he comes to the town of Gerar. Verse 1 says he's temporarily staying in Gerar, and Abraham said about Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And again, God had to intervene. So this is the second time. But I want to show you something. It turned out that the king in both cases, interestingly enough, both with Pharaoh and with Abimelech, the king of Gerar, they who Abraham suspected were ungodly and were going to kill him, ended up practically in the situation, in a practical sense in the situation, being more godly than Abraham. Because both Pharaoh and Abimelech were very repentant that they had taken Abraham's wife, very upset that Abraham had pawned her off to them as her sister, and both of them gave Abraham loads of presents to kind of make up for this potential sin that they had committed by being with his wife, even though they were only with her because Abraham lied to him. So it's, and there's a lesson in that, which is that, we have that saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge a person until you really get into their heart and soul. I mean, by all rights, Pharaoh and Abimelech could have been, but Abimelech was living in the Philistine area. He could have killed Abraham, but instead he was incredibly repentant and upset that Abraham had given him his wife. So we have to be very cautious about judging people, and there's a very great lesson in there. But look at what Abraham says in verse 13, because Abraham's explaining to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, why he gave Sarah away. And he says in verse 13, and when God had me wander from my father's house, meaning when I left Haran and Ur of the Chaldees, I said to Sarah, this is the kindness that you can show to me. Everywhere we go, say about me, he's my brother. So the Bible gives us two records, Egypt and Gerar. But the fact of the matter is, this may have happened at other times as well, maybe without such dire consequences. But it's intriguing that Abraham, even though God told him to go into the promised land, he's already preparing himself to take what I would consider to be a downhill step and give away his wife in order to save his life. And how in the world is Sarah supposed to have a son with all that? Anyway, all this stuff is stuff to work out. But I want to show you, I want to go back to Genesis chapter 12, because Abraham gives away his wife, and sure enough, Pharaoh takes her into his harem. Verse 16, and he treated Abram well for her sake. Abram is now brother-in-law to Pharaoh of Egypt. That's a pretty powerful position to operate from. And Pharaoh treated her well, so that Abraham came to have sheep, cattle, male donkeys, male slaves, female donkeys, camels, So Abraham is in a very powerful bargaining position because he has entree to Pharaoh. So people that want to get, things done in Egypt are going to come to Abraham, because it was common in the culture to work through an intermediary and bring Abram gifts and say, by the way, could you mention to Pharaoh this? By the way, could you mention to Pharaoh that? Plus the fact that Abram himself was a pretty astute businessman. So interestingly enough, Abraham goes down to Egypt and he's got some flocks and herds, but he doesn't have much. But then when he's down in Egypt, and this is kind of an interesting, we talk about funny kind of backwards lessons. He goes down to Egypt, he pawns off his wife, lies about his wife, and pawns off his wife as his sister to Pharaoh, and as a result becomes very wealthy. And so God can bless us even when we're in the midst of sin. And that's something, a lot of times we're our own worst enemies. A lot of times when we sin or when we make a mistake, we're so ashamed of ourselves or in such condemnation or doubting ourselves. How could I have done that? Why did I do that? Yada, yada, yada. That what happens then is we're not reaching for that blessing from God. And you and I are the children of God, and we make mistakes like all children do. And what do we want when our children make a mistake? We don't want them to go away and sit in a corner and cry in their beer. We want them to say, wow, I made a mistake, and to reach out. I love it when, you reprove, right now I've got a lot of little grandchildren running around down here in Southwest Florida where I live. And, and I had to reprove one the other day because he'd stolen a toy from another one. That seems to be pretty common little kid behavior. You've got a toy I want, so I'll just take it. I'm bigger than you are. And anyway, so I had to take the toy away from him and give him a little talking to. And then he looks up and he goes, and he wants to be held, and that's just the coolest thing. That should be the natural response. Well, it should be the same with us. When we screw up, and make mistakes and sin, and even if they're stupid sins, and even if we know we shouldn't have done it, the thing for us to do is to go back to God and say, hold me, I'm so sorry. And he always will. And here's Abraham, who's willing to pawn off his wife, and God blesses him by giving him wealth. It's like, wow. And by the way, Abraham, of course, gets his wife back. Verse 17, Yahweh plagued Pharaoh in his house. Pharaoh called Abraham, what is this that you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? Now here's your wife. And the Hebrew here is very, very brief. You can tell reading the Hebrew text that Pharaoh's angry. Just 2 words, take, go. Pharaoh's just like, no more plague. I mean, his area had been plagued. He was worried about his people, and Abraham's the cause of it. And so he's angry at Abram. He says, take, go. We have take her and go, just to make sure that people get the idea. And then verse 20, Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And so basically what they did is they escorted him out of Egypt. They're like, we're making sure you're leaving. And so they got him out of Egypt. But such great lessons there in Genesis chapter 12 about how we can be blessed even when we make mistakes and stuff. We've got to, kind of get off our own case. So now look at what happens in verse 1 and 2. So Abraham went up out of Egypt, he, his wife, and all that he had. Pharaoh didn't even take back his stuff. He let Abraham leave with it. The blessing of God, by the way, this is kind of a precursor, if you will, of the Exodus, because Abraham goes down to Egypt, makes a mistake there, yet Pharaoh ends up plagued and cursed. Abraham leaves with a bunch of money. I mean, that's exactly what happened in the Exodus, 400-ish years later. So he leaves and goes back into the Negev. Verse 2, Abram was very wealthy in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And that wealth was acquired in Egypt. So when it came to the fact about Abraham being wealthy, the tipping point was Egypt. And that's important. And so he goes on breaking camp, and moving back up north into the northern Negev and whatever. And if you read verse 3, it says he went as far as Bethel, to the place his tent had been at the first between Bethel and Ai, and there was an altar there, the place that he had made earlier, verse 4. And again, Abram called on the name of Yahweh there. So he's praying there, asking for things from God. And then he and Lot separate in the next verses, and Lot goes to the area of Sodom, and that is going to cause lots of problems later. But anyway, Abram and Lot needed to split up. They needed to separate. Lot went towards Sodom because he thought the land there was better for the flocks and herds that he had. And realistically, it may have been, but he got into so much trouble there that he there's a lesson there for us too, that just because something, looks good physically in one way, we've always got to check the spiritual temperature and see whether it's the thing we should do spiritually before God or not. Lot chose the area of Sodom, but verse 13 says, but the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against Yahweh. And then we learn in Hebrews that, or Peter, I'm sorry, in Peter, that Lot was afflicted there. So it may have looked good from a five senses standpoint for taking care of his flocks and herds, but it ended up really hurting him in the end. And then down to verse 14. Now God's going to deal with Abram again. Verse 14, after Lot had separated from him, Yahweh said to Abram, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are to the north and south and east and west. And so Abram was in the middle of the land, between the area of Bethel and Ai, like I say, about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. So Abram was in the middle of the promised land, and God says, look north, south, east, and west. So he's looking over the whole promised land. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your seed forever. And again, we go to Galatians and it says, your seed is Christ, and Christ will be the king over the promised land in the future. Verse 16, I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could count the dust of the earth, then your seed could also be counted. Get up, walk through the land, through its length and its width, because I will give it to you. Verse 18, so Abram moved his tent and went and lived by the oaks of Mamre that are in Hebron. So that tells you that his immediate response was to go about 40 miles south from the area of Bethel and Ai down to Hebron, and he built an altar to Yahweh there. And again, in response to this increased and clarified blessing, that here in these verses 15 and 16, God speaks again about the land, all the land that you see I will give to you, and he speaks about the seed, both at the same time. I will make your seed as the dust of the earth. Walk through the land, says God. So Abraham does. He gets to Hebron, and again, he exerts the time and the energy and the effort to build the slaughter site and worship God. Then Genesis chapter 14 is about Abram and rescuing Lot. And there's a lot in this chapter that's really worth talking about. But in the essence of time, I'm gonna skip over some of this right now, and I want to go down to verse 17. Well, actually, I want to clear up something that was cleared up for me in this process. What you have in Genesis chapter 14 is 4 kings from Mesopotamia. Let me bring up a map so we can talk about this in a little more clarity. Share my screen. So what we have in Genesis 14 is starting with Elam and then moving up across Mesopotamia until you get up into this area. You have 4 kings that put together a huge confederacy, and they swing down through the Transjordan. So the The Transjordan is this area. If this is the Jordan River running down, the Transjordan is this area just east of the Jordan River. And so these four kings form this confederacy, and they swing down and they're wiping out cities and countries all in this area. And then they make a J hook and they swing over and they go as far as Kadesh, and they attack and capture Kadesh. And then they swing up through the Jordan Valley and get the people on the west side of the Jordan River. But they don't go up into the hill country. Now, Abraham's on the west side of the hill country. So if you read the record and study the geography, they come up here on the east side, and it's when they're going by this area where the hand is on the map that they gather up Sodom and Gomorrah and run off with those people. And that, of course, is where Lot is. And the text says that they capture Lot. So Abraham's got to deliver them. And I wanted to show you this because in verse 10, verse 9, against Sherdor Laomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Verse 10, now the plain of Siddim was full of bitumen pits. And by the way, it still has bitumen today. That's the area of the Dead Sea. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some people hid themselves in them, and the rest of them fled to the hill country. Most of your versions are going to say some people fell in them. And the commentaries used to teach that this meant death, that the people died. But more and more of the modern commentaries and commentators are understanding that the Hebrew does not mean that they died in the bitumen pits, but that they hid in them. And so you've got two groups of people. The kings of Mesopotamia attacked, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in the area fled from that attack. Some people hid themselves in the bitumen pits, and that would make them very hard to see because you're looking out over the plain and people are jumping into these pits and hiding, and you couldn't see that pit unless you were right up on top of it. And the rest of them fled to the hill country. So some people hid in the pits, some people fled in the hill country. That is why the king of Sodom and Gomorrah are fleeing and hiding in the bitumen pit. But in just a little tiny bit, down in verse 17, after Abram's return from the repeat of Sherdor Laomer and the kings that were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him. Well, wait a minute. If the king of Sodom had died in a bitumen pit, then he wouldn't be here, but he hid there. By the way, I have a good commentary on the hiding in bitumen pits. So if you read the REV commentary on Genesis 14:10, it can explain that. And so Abraham is returning south. Remember, his home base was Hebron, which was south of Jerusalem. And as he's going south, verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, at this time Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has given your enemies into your hand." And Abraham gave him 1/10 of all. So this is a tithe that Abram gave Melchizedek. This is not a Levitical tithe, but it's a 1/10 of the spoils of war, and he gave that to Melchizedek. Hebrews is going to say that the Levites deserve a tithe because the Levites were in Abram when he gave 1/10 to the priest Melchizedek. And so this is where we get the work about Melchizedek here, and it shows, Abraham, again, he got a blessing through Melchizedek, and he responded to that blessing with a gift. And so once again, we see that when we are blessed by God, the appropriate thing to do is return back things to God. Let's go to chapter 15. We'll do a couple verses there. Verse 1, again, this is stuff that I just recently learned. Verse 1, after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward is exceeding great. The Bible versions that I read for years said, I am your shield and your great reward. But that never made any sense because it's hard to understand how God could be Abram's reward. In fact, there's nothing ever mentioned in the Bible. The Abraham record is very long and takes up a number of chapters. There's nothing anywhere in any of the chapters that somehow or other God is Abram's reward. So, but I didn't know that you could translate it another way until Bill and I got to this verse to translate it a couple weeks ago. And all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, what? And then you find out that there's actually a number of modern versions that translate it like the REB does. Now, if we pick it apart from this standpoint, if we look at it and unpack it, all of a sudden it makes sense. Because first of all, Abraham now, he's just avoided being captured by these kings from the north. And then he rounded up an army and defeated the kings from the north. And after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram saying, do not be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield. In other words, I'm helping you be successful. I'm protecting you from people and I'm helping you be successful. And I could say the same thing for us today, that God helps us. This is a great lesson. God helps us and he helps us be successful. And then God says, your reward is exceeding great. And Abraham already knew that. He was promised a seed. God said, you're going to have a seed. And God said, you're going to have the land. But the thing was that God had been saying that now for 25 years or so, maybe 23. Anyway, he'd been saying it for a long time. And meanwhile, Abraham has no seed and no land. So God keeps making these promises. You're going to have all this seed like the stars of heaven, the sand of the sea, and you're going to have land. And here's Abraham, and he's like, because those promises have been made but not fulfilled. So I love what happens here is Abraham has a very honest conversation with God. And it starts out with, but Abraham said. Now, Abraham recognizes who God is. He said, Lord Yahweh. Abraham is very respectful to God, but he's also a businessman and he's very pointed. He says, what will you give me since I continue to be childless? And he who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus. Now, Eleazar was probably, because it says in the next verse, he was, a member of Abraham's household, which could mean extended family. It could have been that Eleazar was born in Abram's house and then moved to Damascus because he was particularly good at organizing things or whatever. And Damascus was a major money center of the time, major money and commerce. So Abraham here is speaking very honestly with Abraham. And it's a great lesson for us because Hebrews chapter 4 says, that what God wants from us is open and honest speech. Let's just go there real quick. And this will be kind of beginning to close out the teaching here. Verse 16 says, therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with open and honest speech in order to receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let us approach the throne of grace with open and honest speech. And that's exactly what Abraham did. He said, but Lord Yahweh, what will you give me, seeing I continue to be childless? So Abraham here, he's risked his life. He's wandered in the promised land, and none of the promises that God made to him has been fulfilled at this point. And Abram said, behold, you've given me no seed. A member of my household is my heir. Verse 4, but behold, the word of Yahweh came to him saying, this man will not be your heir, but he will come out of your own body will be your heir. And Yahweh brought him outside and said, look now toward the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said to Abram, so will your seed be. Verse 6, and Abraham believed Yahweh. It doesn't say he believed in Yahweh. He'd always believed in Yahweh. But here he believed Yahweh. It registered with him, this is really going to happen. And God credited it to him as righteousness. And that's where you and I are today, thankfully, that we believe Yahweh, and that belief gets credited as righteousness. And we've got to stick with that. And then God's going to continue his relationship with Abram. But Abraham is called a friend of God, and he's called the father of the faith. And he risked a lot, and he made a lot of mistakes. And God worked with him and blessed him and gave him promises, and those promises came true. And God has given us promises, and those promises will come true also. So as we study Abraham, we can learn a lot about ourselves and how we should walk in the faith. Thanks for being with me in this slightly protracted teaching. I appreciate it, and trust that you've learned a lot. As Bill and I have translated, I've learned a lot that I did not know before. So it's been a super blessing. So thank you all for being here, and God bless you all.